Alright, so as many of you guys have clicked onto this video, I hope you have finished watching the Prime Minister and prep videos that we have already offered from the EB board. Today, we will mostly be talking about the second speaker role. I'm Nusaiba, and you'll be learning about essentially how to farm rebuttals, how you can actually utilize them in your cases to make sure you get very high speaker points as well as get the opportunity to win a debate, because DPM speeches are actually quite underrated. They're overlooked, but they're very important, and a lot of different things have been happening recently. A lot of the meta has changed, but if you do use these tips and tricks, I can assure you that you'll probably do extremely well, even if it's your first debate. So as a novice speaker, even when I first started debating, I really didn't understand what DPM, DLO, what these speaker positions meant. Essentially, DPM means Deputy Prime Minister. And if you're on this side opposition, you'll be known as DLO. So you do have to write your name and position before the debate begins. You have to submit it to your ACH, and then you start the debate, right? Alright, so DPM essentially comes after the LO, which is Leader of Opposition, the first speaker of the opposition team. What your job, first of all, is to do, start with rebuttals. Your main job is to attack. You're going to defend your case as much as possible with rebuttals, and rebuttals should be a very big chunk of your entire debate because your speech comes literally after the opposition's leader. You listen to them as attentively as you can possibly do so, because it's very important. You need to listen to everything, nitpick everything, try to form rebuttals according to whatever they tell you, and with that, you're going to present or start your case. So what do you do essentially? Alright, so let's start with the rebuttal part, okay? In order for you to actually excel in the rebuttal part, you need to know a few tips, right? What essentially do you do? Well, you listen to your opposition. You're going to write down everything that they say. And anything that needs a lot of rebuttal, let's say their main argument, you have to refute it. You go there. If you don't do it, it's going to be very harmful for your case, for your team, because your team has to essentially disprove whatever argument the opposition comes up with, right? You have to make it seem as if, look, whatever the argument they're saying, whatever case they're presenting is obviously not right because of XYZ reasons. So how do you make a rebuttal? Here's a little exercise for you guys. Let's say opposition comes up and says something like this. They're claiming that A, climate change is less important than economic growth, right? You're going to write this claim. After that, what you're going to do is you're going to write the statements. First part of your statement should be, what is the premise of this entire claim that they're making as opposition? So the premise for, let's say, climate change is less important than economic growth, the premise could be that poor people do not care about climate change, right? Because it just goes to show that, oh, if climate change is economically, these two things are exclusive, mutually exclusive, then it just means that poor people do not care about climate change. It's a premise that they're making. It's an assumption they're making. Now you have to disprove that. And the second premise for this is that climate change and economic growth, well, they're mutually exclusive. Now, how do you rebut this? Now, there is one solid example. Please do not mind the background noise. With that being said, first rebuttal that you could use is, poor people in third world countries, they do actually care about climate change. Why? Because they are disproportionately affected versus richer countries. How exactly is that the case? Look, poor people, poor countries, they don't have the funds needed to essentially build flood walls, to carry out irrigation. If they were to fall under a natural disaster, what would their scenario look like? They would go through agricultural collapse. But let's say the same thing were to happen with Britain. Britain is a developed country. It has the funds. It can build flood walls. In fact, it can build and take necessary precautions needed to withstand natural disasters, something which poor countries, developing countries cannot because, well, their GDP is suffering. So what do you do in that case? These poor people, especially, obviously, will care about climate change. So in that context, they're not going to uphold climate change as something that is as less important than economic change, okay? Poor people in Asia, America, if they do care, they're going to make a huge difference in the climate change landscape, because guess what? Britain is like 10% of the population. Total people in like Asia and America together will create a bigger population, and if they try to do something, it will be a bigger impact, won't it be? Now, with that being said, I would also like to point out a certain detail that you should not be missing, which is whenever you write down whatever opposition is saying, write it in a different colored ink. What I like to do is basically whatever my opposition tells me, I write it down with red ink, and whenever I'm answering the rebuttal in my paper, I just do it in black ink. And then when my speech comes, I just refer to their speech via that red pen. Like, it might sound very silly, like why do you have to be this disorganized, in fact, but it's actually quite useful. It's going to be very helpful, especially during tournaments, when once you're in that spot when you're giving the speech, it's going to give you nervousness. You're going to have that adrenaline rush soar through your veins. So you need everything to be as organized as possible in order for your speech to be as smooth and efficient as it can possibly be. Because at the end of the day, you want to convince the edge that your side is the better side. Your world has better things to offer for the stakeholder. And I'm pretty sure after watching the other videos, you understand what stakeholders are, so I will not go into much detail. Now, after you're done with the rebuttal, that was just one example. What you do next is you're going to restate your first speaker's argument. So let's say your first speaker missed out on some mechanization, right? They failed to mechanize a few of the arguments that you guys were putting forth. What you'll do is spend some time, not a lot of time, just spend time to explain whatever your first speaker missed, and then you move on to your unique arguments. But before you do that, you can actually sneak in your arguments using rebuttals. How exactly is that? Let's talk about that climate change versus economic change that opposition claimed, right? After I rebut, what I can now do essentially is you can say, this proves the fact and makes us move on to our next argument, which is economic growth can only occur if less climate change happens. See, it's directly contradicting, going against their case, right? How do you explain this? Start with questions. Literally ask questions to edges because it makes your speech that much more convincing. So why? Because economic impacts of climate change, what exactly are they? 4 things. 1, billions of dollars normally get spent in natural disaster. If you don't take proper necessary precautions to withstand natural disaster, even if you have the necessary precautions, let's say flood walls or whatever, you're still going to be suffering from natural disaster if that were to occur. Right? Because that's just the nature of natural disaster, and you lose out on billions of dollars. And sometimes flooding can happen of major cities. Again, you're going to lose out on a lot of resource time, efficiency. I mean, your workers will get stuck, waterlogged. There could also be crop failure, and there could lead to refugee crisis. So once you're mentioning these points, do explain them. Like right now I'm giving you brief ideas, but what you essentially have to do is, like, for example, let's talk about the refugee crisis. You mentioned that, look, economic impacts of climate change is refugee crisis. Why? Because if climate change were to occur, a lot of people would have to migrate from places that have been affected by natural disasters. Say farmland got affected by flooding, so your crops are failing and there's not a lot of things that you can really do. Let's think about Bangladesh, the recent flood that happened. A lot of people had to migrate to places that were higher in altitude, right? So they could be safe in order to save themselves. So refugee crisis can ensue, which is not essentially ideal for a country when it comes to their economic problems. Because look, if you want to fix the issues that a natural disaster is bringing, you'll have to spend in months, like billions and billions of dollars into fixing that, and that's going to actually lead to an economic decline. All right. Now, before I do move on, I'd like to clarify one thing. I did not mean America. I'm sorry about that. I mostly meant developing countries that are poor, have suffering GDP in Asia. So don't mention America. That's going to very much contradict your case. That was just a little slip of tongue since AA, but do not do that. This is just a little introductory class, and I'm pretty sure it will be helpful. Just keep listening to this video, and I'm pretty sure you'll have the right case in your mind. You'll know what to do for DPM speeches. Yeah. Okay, so the second thing that you could do for this exact argument, how can you make this argument even more solid? Give illustrations. So tell them, look, imagine a person has been affected by flood and he's living in a developing country, let's say, whose GDP is falling. They do not have enough resources to fix their healthcare system, to reform their education system. They have issues going on within their country. There's political strife, religious strife going on, communalism going on. What does that person do in that context when their entire home is literally getting blown away by the wind? The thing is, he can't go to the government and be like, oh, rebuild my house because look, the entire country is suffering already, right? So in that context, what we have to do is we have to think about climate change. Climate change is equally as important for the development of that country's economy. If the country wants to go from a developing state to a developed state, it needs to start caring about climate change now. It's not an issue that is only exclusive to developed countries. In fact, developing countries have a lot more to lose if they were affected by climate change. That is why they have to curb climate change. They have to invest in climate change technologies. Even though they don't have the funds, they can still contribute by implementing environmentalist regulations when it comes to foreign corporations. Let's say foreign corporations are coming from different countries around the world to developing countries. You can think of an example, let's say, Apple. yeah, Apple sets up MNCs in China where the products are assembled there, and then these products, after they're formed, they go to California and then they're put in place together, right? So a lot of environmental destruction can happen in that country because, well, if the regulations are not properly fixed, then a lot of pollution can happen. So what these developing countries could do, in fact, they could just enforce some environmental regulations so that their environment is or ecosystem is not impacted as much by climate change. So these are the little things that they can do, right? You can see what I'm going at, right? First, I talked about rebuttals. I mean, I just gave one example. There will be multiple rebuttals. You have to refute them. Spend 2 to 3 minutes on that. After that, if your PM has forgotten to mention some things that are very important and crucial for the debate, mention them, mechanize them. Third thing, come up with your own argument. So when you're doing prep time, make sure that you have something unique to contribute to the table. If you just repeat whatever the PM said, it's going to sound very redundant, and that doesn't look good on your case, does it? So do try to come up with an argument that's exclusively on your side. You're going to explain that. You can sneak in rebuttals into arguments. That's very tricky, and personally, I love doing that. And I love when people do that. It just sounds way more compelling, and it just is way more intellectual, isn't it? So follow these. After that, you spend your time trying to prove your case, end your speech, that's it. Literally, that's all you have to know about DPM speeches. And if you have any questions, do ask, go ahead, comment. You can DM me personally, but that is all. You don't need anything else for DPM, literally. Just try to make sure your case is as solid. Try to make the ADJ believe in your case more. Always just keep mentioning that on our side, the stakeholders are going to be more benefited than their side because we are giving these reasons. With that, I hope you have a safe day. I hope this helps you, and good luck for the intro.